In this video, I'm continuing my series of lessons looking at 7th arpeggios. And all of this is essential guitar knowledge stuff, I think. And as I said in the previous video, if you know your arpeggios, you'll be able to elegantly improvise over just about any chord progression that comes your way. Arpeggios are particularly useful when you're playing jazz, where the harmony is often more complex and you've got non-diatonic chords, modulations, that kind of thing. And in that situation, even with the most complex chord progression, if you just stick to arpeggios and chord tones, you can't really go wrong. And I also find arpeggios useful in just about any style of music. Even chord progressions where all the chords are in the same key, you can still describe the chord progressions and play the changes in a much more melodic way if you think arpeggios rather than scales. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the theory of major 7th arpeggios. I'm going to show you how I lay out these arpeggios on the guitar, the shapes that I use, how I like to associate my arpeggio shapes with chord shapes. Then I'll give you a couple of exercises so you can start working these arpeggio shapes into your playing, and I'll talk about how you might make music with them as well. But I'm going to begin by having an improvise. I've made a backing track and we've got a cycle of 4 quite unrelated major 7th chords, and I'm going to take a solo. I'm going to try and just stick to the major 7th arpeggios. So let's see what happens. Start with a bit of gentle music theory, and if you've not seen the 2 previous videos in this series, you might like to check those out. There's a video on minor 7th arpeggios and dominant 7th arpeggios, and I'm going to be organising all of the material in this video in a very similar kind of a way. So the theory with major 7th arpeggios is pretty straightforward really. I think the easiest way to think about it is like this. If you've got a major scale, you just start on the root note of the scale and then take every other note in that scale until you've built a major 7th arpeggio. So if we take a C major scale, we've got the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B and C, and if we take every other note in that sequence of notes, we've got C, and then we skip to E, and then G, and then B, and that gives us a simple C major 7th arpeggio. So C, E, G, B, and then you can go up to the starting note, the root note, an octave higher, and then you could continue on into the next octave if you wanted to. So C, E, G, B, and then C. That's a 2-octave C major 7th arpeggio. And you can come at this information in a few different ways. Clearly you've got a shape on the fingerboard, and you can play a C major 7th arpeggio in any number of different ways on the fretboard. This is just one possibility, but you obviously want to learn some finger shapes. And then I think you want to go beyond just finger patterns, and you really want to understand what's going on. So there are the note names, which obviously these note names are specific to a C major 7th arpeggio. If you play it from a different root note, the notes are going to be different. But in a C major 7th arpeggio, we got C, E, G and B. And then it's important to understand the function of these notes, or the intervals that are going on in this arpeggio. So we've got the root note here, or the 1, and then the E is the 3rd, and then the G is the 5th, and then the B is the 7th. So we've got root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, or root, major 3rd, perfect 5th, major 7th if you want to be precise about it. So whenever you're playing these arpeggios, starting from any root note, you really want to know what functions the notes are playing when you're playing the notes. So know whether you're playing a third or you're on a fifth or whatever it might be. And you also want to have the sound of these arpeggios in your brain and in your ears. So you really want to listen to those notes, and it helps to be able to sing those notes, I think. So try this exercise away from the guitar. So sing a root note, da, and then see if you can hear and then sing a major 7th arpeggio. So da 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 da. It's not about having a great voice, it's just about having that connection between your ears and your brain. So when might you use a major 7th arpeggio? And in this video I'm going to try and keep it quite simple. I'm not going to go into advanced jazz superimposition or any crazy stuff like that. But at its most basic level, if you've got a major 7th chord, you can play the appropriate major 7th arpeggio over it, and it's obviously going to be a perfect fit because you're just playing the notes from the chord. And to some extent, if you've got just a simple major chord, you can also try playing a major 7th arpeggio over that as well, and you're just introducing that extra 7th colour. But it's worth being aware of the fact that the major 7th arpeggio naturally occurs in a couple of places in major key. So if you know your harmonised major scale, you'll know that the 1 chord is a major 7th chord, and also the 4 chord is a major 7th chord. So if you're playing over a chord progression, it's worth trying to identify how a major chord is functioning. Is it a 1 chord? Is it a 4 chord? If so, you could probably play a major 7th arpeggio over it. If you've got a major chord and it's functioning more as a 5 chord, then you've got to be a bit more careful playing a major 7th arpeggio over that, because it might sound a bit odd. Let's map some of this stuff out on the fretboard then. And again, I'm going to organise this information in the same way that I did in those previous videos. So I've got 5 major 7th arpeggio patterns which I'm associating with chords. It's a kind of caged system approach, which I think is probably the best way to come at this information initially. I know there are other ways of organising this stuff on the fretboard, but I think the caged system is probably the best all-round way, and then maybe once you've got that down you can explore some other ways of playing these arpeggios. Let's do this from a G root note just so all of these shapes fit neatly on the fretboard. And I'm going to start down here with what I would call pattern 1, and this is the E form if you're thinking in terms of caged. So the chord shape that I would use here would be this one here. It's kind of a jazz major 7th voicing, a kind of drop 3 voicing. So we've got the root note, and then we've got the major 7th, the 3rd, and then the 5th. And then the arpeggio fingering would be this one. It's the same fingering that I used earlier on from a C root note. Here we're starting on a G, and we've got root, 3rd, 5th, there's the 7th, and then root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, and back to the root again. And you've got that 7th available 1 fret below the root as well. So quite often the drill that I will do will be to play the chord, then to play the arpeggio, and then to play the chord again. So you're really cementing that relationship between the chord and the arpeggio. Then we're up into the next zone of the neck. It's the D form, and the chord shape would look like this. So I've got 5th fret on the D string, and then 7th fret on the top 3 strings, and the arpeggio shape would be this. So I would always start and finish these shapes on the root note, although we've got notes down below the root in the case of this particular pattern. I'm starting on the root and then I'm going up, so root, 3rd, 5th, 7, root, 3rd. That's the highest note available in this position. Then I'm descending down below the root. That's my lowest note, this B, in this particular position. You might be tempted to go down 1 note further, but that kind of takes you away from this position and into the previous one. So I'm just going to stop on that B note, and then I'm going to go back up and finish on the root note again. So chord, arpeggio, Next zone of the neck is this one here. This is the C form, and the major 7 chord shape looks like this. So starting on this G root note, it's fret 10, then 9, and then 7, 7, 7. These are the same 3 notes that we had in the previous chord shape. There's an overlap between those 2 chords. And then the arpeggio looks like this. Again, going from root to root, and this one falls quite naturally under the fingers. There are no stretches or any awkward stuff in this particular pattern. The previous pattern was a little bit awkward in places, but this one just sits right there under the fingers. Next up, we've got the A form, or I would call this pattern 4 generally, and our chord shape is this. We've got frets 10, 12, 11 and 12, so it's a kind of drop 2 jazz type voicing once again. And the arpeggio shape this time is so I'm going up to this high F sharp up here. It's just stretching up to that note. I'm going to include that. You don't have to. You could just make the D the highest note if you wanted to. Going down as far as this low D, and then back up and finishing on the root. And then finally we're up into the G shape, and the chord shape here is a little bit more awkward. I guess you could do this. It's a bit of an awkward stretch, that one. So 15, 14, 12, 11, or perhaps easier would be this one here. So we've got 12, 12, 12 on the DGB, and then 14 on the high E. And then the arpeggio shape would look like this. So root, 3rd, 5th, stretching up for the major 7th there with my little finger. Then we got the root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, and a high G root. So those are the 5 chord shapes and related arpeggio shapes. Quite a lot of information here, so take your time to get familiar with this stuff if this is all new information to you. And I would do those drills, so play the chord, play the arpeggio smoothly up and down. I would tend to use alternate picking for that, and then play the chord again. And on top of that, you might also like to think about the intervals that you're playing. So you might even go as far as to actually say the names of the intervals out loud as you're playing each of these shapes. So you might be going root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, root, 7th, 5th, 3rd, root, 7th, 5th, 3rd, root, 7th, root. That's a really thorough way of doing it, and it just gets you used to thinking in terms of intervals rather than just in terms of finger shapes. And you could also obviously do this in some different keys as well, depending on the key that you're playing in. It won't always start with pattern 1 neatly down at this end of the fretboard. It could start on any one of those 5 caged shapes. And it's good to know the names of the notes in your 7th arpeggios as well. So a little bit of mental theory work. You could just recite to yourself the names of your 7th arpeggios, just so you know which notes belong to those arpeggios, which arpeggios have sharps and flats, and all of that kind of information. Once you've got the arpeggios just going straight up and down, I would encourage you to do some exercises just to get to know the arpeggios a little bit more deeply. It's good technical practice, and it also gives you some ideas that you can use in a real musical situation. So you might like to try some sequence ideas, very similar to what you do with scales. You can do those with arpeggios as well. So if we take this G major 7th arpeggio, we could play that arpeggio in what I would call a group of 3 sequence. So So just thinking groups of 3 notes from each of the notes in the arpeggio, starting on the root, going up 3, then we start on the 3rd and go up 3, and then the 5th up 3, and so on through the arpeggio. And just reverse that coming down. You could try a group of 4 version of that same exercise. Lots of possibilities here. I quite like this one as well. So here I'm thinking about pairs of notes, and I'm descending in each pair whilst going up through the arpeggio, if that makes sense. So I've got B to G, and then D to B, F sharp to D, up through the arpeggio. And then you can do the opposite coming down. So I'm going up within each pair but going down the arpeggio. So you might like to try the exercise which I discussed in both of the previous videos, where you're working on connecting pairs of these arpeggio shapes together. And I'm not going to go into detail on this exercise in this video because it's exactly the same concept, but just briefly, the idea is we're taking a pair of chords, so for example G major 7 and C major 7, and we're finding those arpeggios in the same position of the neck, and we're trying to change smoothly from one chord to the next. And this is a really important skill. If you're playing over a chord progression, you don't want to be able to hear the joins where the chord changes, and you haven't got a nice melodic flow to what you're doing. So it's a really good exercise to work on that. So you might just give yourself a bar on each of those chords, play continuous 8th notes, and then try and connect your arpeggio to the closest note in the next arpeggio at the right moment. Let me finish by talking about the little improvisation that I did earlier. This is another really good way to work on your arpeggios. And on my backing track I just had a fairly random sequence of major 7th chords, and the challenge was to try and improvise over that just using arpeggios in a musical and melodic kind of a way. So the chords were these. It was just C major 7 and then going up in minor 3rd. So then we had E flat major 7, G flat major 7 and A major 7. So those chords are not really related, they're kind of little musical islands, and you can choose to just describe each of those chords how you like, but I'm here playing the major 7th arpeggio that's appropriate to each of those chords. So one way into this might be to try and improvise just using one area of the fretboard and see if you can find all 4 of those arpeggios within a 4 or 5 fret area. So if you started here, for example, with C major 7 in the E form, then the nearest E major 7th shape is going to be this one. In the G form, and then we've got an F sharp major 7 shape, so that would be this one here, A form. And then we've got A major 7, and sticking in this same kind of area of the fretboard, we've got this shape here available. So just limiting yourself to one area of the fretboard forces you to mix these arpeggio shapes, and it means that you can connect them together smoothly rather than jumping to the same shape horizontally along the fretboard. I mean, sometimes that can work and sound good, but it's a good discipline, I think, to work in one area of the fretboard and smoothly connect through different shapes. And you can really try this exercise with any set of chords. You might like to start with just a pair of chords, or you can use 4 chords, and you can kind of make the changes fairly random, and that just kind of keeps you on your toes and makes you think. But I've just got the chord progression in my looper here, and I'm just very simply going to improvise through that chord progression and see what happens. Things to bear in mind when you're improvising using arpeggios: you obviously want it to sound musical and not like you're just going up and down an arpeggio shape. So that's when smooth connections between these shapes is really helpful. So you're continuing the direction of your line through the chord change, whether you're ascending or descending. Also, just remember simple things like rhythm. If you've got some rhythmic interest, then it's going to sound less like an exercise and more like music. So let me just try this. I'm going to keep it very simple, just in this zone of the neck, and see what happens. So have a play around with that. It's a fun way of getting familiar with all of these arpeggio shapes and to start making music with them. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you what gear I'm using today. So guitar is my Fender Jazzmaster, amp is my little Fender Super Champ. And I have actually made a video where I go into a bit of detail about this particular amp. So if you'd like a bit more information, then take a look at that. In the little improvisation I played at the start of this video, I was using a few pedals. So we had some overdrive from the J Rocket Archer, delay from the Catlin Bred Belle Epoque Deluxe, and I also had a bit of MXR Phase 90 as well. That's quite a cool sound, I think, soloing with a Phase 90. And then for that improvisation that you just saw, I was using a looper pedal. That was the TC Electronic Ditto, and that's one of my favourite looper pedals. It's perfect if you just want to quickly record a backing to improvise over. That's it for this video. Hope you found it interesting and hope you find the information here useful. As usual, over on my Patreon page, there's going to be various tabs and chord and arpeggio diagrams, and I'll put my backing track up there as well. So check that out. If you're interested, you can pay what you like and get access to my entire huge archive of tabs and backing tracks. And I think that's probably it for this arpeggio series, unless you want me to do videos on the weirdos like diminished and minor 7 flat 5. Maybe I should do that. I might do that a little bit later in the year. Let me know if you'd like to see that. But thanks for watching today, and I'll see you next time.